long before Azkaban became the notorious wizard prison feared by all in the magical world. It was merely an isolated fortress standing starkly against the harsh waves of the North Sea. Constructed sometime during the 15th century, Azkaban's original purpose wasn't to detain criminals or enforce justice. Rather, it served as a grim sanctuary for a profoundly sinister wizard, Ecrizdis. Little is known about Ecrizdis beyond his infamy and cruelty. He dwelled in seclusion on this desolate island, far removed from the eyes of both wizard and muggle societies. Ecrizdis was deeply entrenched in the practice of dark magic, notorious for capturing and tormenting sailors who had the misfortune of becoming lost and washing ashore. His vile deeds went unnoticed, veiled by powerful enchantments that kept the island hidden and inaccessible to outsiders. Ecrizdis's charms ensured no rescue would come, turning Azkaban into his own twisted domain of suffering. After many years, Ecrizdis eventually died, and with his death, the protective concealment spells gradually began to fade, unveiling the island's dark secrets to the outside world. Eventually, the island caught the attention of the Ministry of Magic. Upon arrival, Ministry officials were horrified to discover Azkaban not only as a place of great suffering and evil, but also inhabited by creatures that thrived on despair and fear, dementors. These terrifying beings, described chillingly by Professor Remus Lupin, embody the essence of despair. Dementors drain peace, hope, and happiness out of the air around them. Even muggles feel their presence, though they can't see them. Get too near a Dementor and every good feeling, every happy memory will be sucked out of you. It became apparent that these Dementors had been drawn to Azkaban by Ecrizdis's brutal cruelty and the pervasive dark magic that he had performed. The Dementors, left unchecked for decades, had multiplied and thrived, feeding upon the residual anguish lingering in the stones themselves. The Ministry now faced a disturbing and complex problem. What could possibly be done about Azkaban and the Dementors residing there? Establishment as a prison. By the year 1718, the Ministry of Magic stood at a crossroads concerning the fate of Azkaban. The isolated fortress, now openly visible following the weakening of its concealment enchantments, was occupied by Dementors who had been drawn to its terrible history. Officials found themselves grappling with an uncomfortable and critical decision. What was to be done about this accursed place? At first, Ministry leaders considered the possibility of destroying the fortress entirely. Such drastic measures seemed justified given the horror and misery that permeated its very walls. However, the Dementors presented an insurmountable problem. Officials feared that if Azkaban was demolished, these sinister creatures would be forced onto the mainland, bringing untold terror and chaos to the general population. Faced with no easy solution, the Ministry was forced to look for alternative strategies. It was then that Damocles Roll, Minister for Magic at the time, made a fateful and controversial decision. He proposed converting Azkaban into an official wizard prison, reasoning that the Dementors' innate ability to drain happiness and hope would make them perfect guards. After all, no prisoner would be able to summon the mental fortitude necessary for escape when faced with such relentless psychological torment. Roll's decision was seen as practical by some, but deeply troubling by others, igniting fierce debate within the Ministry. Nevertheless, the proposal was approved. Soon afterward, Azkaban officially opened its gates, not as a secretive fortress hidden in darkness, but as the wizarding world's most secure and feared prison. From its inception, Azkaban proved chillingly effective. Prisoners incarcerated within its bleak walls quickly succumbed to the overpowering despair enforced by their Dementor guards. The result was an unprecedented record. Virtually no escapes occurred for over 2 centuries, solidifying Azkaban's grim reputation as the ultimate punishment for the wizarding community. Yet, despite this effectiveness, Azkaban immediately attracted criticism. Many in the wizarding world were horrified by the conditions under which prisoners were held. Humane advocates and ethical campaigners loudly protested against what they saw as sanctioned torture. Dementors, after all, were not impartial jailers, but creatures thriving on anguish, tormenting prisoners until they were shells of their former selves. Years later, Albus Dumbledore would summarize these concerns vividly. The Dementors affect you worse than the others, because there are horrors in your past that the others don't have. Dementors are among the foulest creatures that walk this earth. They infest the darkest, filthiest places. They glory in decay and despair. These moral objections, however, fell largely on deaf ears. For the Ministry, the practicality and effectiveness of Azkaban outweighed the ethical concerns, at least for the time being. Notable criticism and attempts at reform. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Azkaban became increasingly infamous, not just for its near-perfect record of preventing escapes, but for the sheer brutality inflicted upon prisoners by its Dementor guards. Within the wizarding community, the prison soon symbolized not justice, but fear and inhumanity. Even within the Ministry itself, voices of dissent occasionally surfaced. Some officials openly criticized the use of Dementors, condemning their methods as excessively cruel and morally indefensible. They argued that justice administered through torture was no justice at all. However, these concerns were repeatedly dismissed or ignored, seen as overly sentimental or impractical by the majority who valued Azkaban's flawless security record above all else. These critics highlighted the devastating psychological effects of Dementor exposure. Prisoners invariably fell into profound depression, many driven to madness or even death by the relentless drain of hope. The Dementors did more than simply guard. They fed upon misery, turning punishment into a perpetual cycle of torment. Yet despite continuous protests and reports documenting these severe conditions, the Ministry's stance remained unchanged. For them, the effectiveness of Azkaban outweighed ethical considerations. The early 20th century saw the criticism escalate significantly in response to increasing public pressure. A formal Ministry investigation was finally launched. This investigation thoroughly documented the atrocious conditions within Azkaban, providing undeniable evidence of the severe mental deterioration prisoners suffered at the hands of the Dementors. Advocates hoped this official recognition would lead to meaningful reform. Unfortunately, the political climate at the time was tense, and the Ministry, fearful of appearing weak or undermining public confidence, ultimately chose stability and perceived security over humanity. The report was quietly shelved, and Azkaban continued to operate unchanged, a dark stain on the wizarding world's collective conscience. Years later, Remus Lupin aptly captured the essence of the criticism leveled against Azkaban's conditions when speaking to Harry Potter. They don't need walls and water to keep the prisoners in, not when they're trapped inside their own heads, incapable of a single cheerful thought. Most of them go mad within weeks. This poignant observation underscored the fundamental cruelty embedded in Azkaban's system, a cruelty that would remain unaddressed for decades to come. Azkaban during Voldemort's first rise. By the 1970s, as Lord Voldemort began his terrifying ascent, Azkaban found itself at the center of one of the darkest chapters in wizarding history. The prison, already feared for its despair and isolation, became the holding ground for many of the most dangerous and devoted Death Eaters, followers of Voldemort who carried out unspeakable acts in his name. During this period, Azkaban's function shifted from merely being a prison to becoming a symbol of the state's last line of defense against the chaos Voldemort unleashed. Many infamous names passed through its gates, including Bellatrix Lestrange, a fanatical supporter of the Dark Lord, and Barty Crouch Jr., who was imprisoned for the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom using the Cruciatus Curse. Although the Ministry had not yet fallen under Voldemort's influence, the prison operated at near capacity. Public fear ran high, and many suspected wrongdoers were swiftly incarcerated, sometimes without fair trials. However, during these early years, the Dementors remained loyal to the Ministry of Magic, ensuring that no prisoners escaped, regardless of their connections or powers. Their loyalty, though never truly grounded in ideology, was maintained through their need to feed, and the Ministry, for better or worse, continued to supply them with victims. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Sirius Black reflected grimly on the prison's impact, even on those who were truly guilty. You've no idea. It's not the cold, not the dark. It's the hopelessness. That's what Dementors feed on. You could be living in a palace and feel it. You lose all sense of who you are. This era of imprisonment had a particularly terrifying effect. Some Death Eaters were so loyal to Voldemort that they clung to the belief that he would one day return and free them. Bellatrix Lestrange, upon her escape years later, declared, "The Dark Lord will rise again. Crouch, throw us into Azkaban. We will wait. He will rise again and come for us. He will reward us beyond any of his other supporters." Her unwavering conviction, even amid the soul-draining despair of Azkaban, spoke volumes about the fanaticism Voldemort inspired and the limits of even Dementor punishment. During this time, Azkaban remained secure, the fortress held strong, and the Dementors remained on the Ministry's side. But shadows were lengthening, and the prison's impenetrability would soon be tested in ways no one had imagined. Notable escapes. For centuries, Azkaban had stood unchallenged, a fortress as impenetrable as fear itself. Yet, even the most formidable prison can be breached, and in the latter part of the 20th century, Azkaban's legendary security began to falter. These cracks would not only shock the wizarding world, but also signal the beginning of a broader collapse in the Ministry's control over the Dementors. The first significant breach occurred in the early 1980s, though it was not discovered until much later. Barty Crouch Jr., imprisoned for torturing the Longbottoms alongside the Lestranges, was smuggled out by his own mother, terminally ill and desperate to see her son free. She consumed Polyjuice Potion to swap appearances with him. The two switched places inside Azkaban, and she died there, her identity never revealed until years later. Though this escape was orchestrated through deception, it demonstrated a critical vulnerability in Azkaban's system, one that relied almost entirely on the Dementors, who could not discern a person's identity if emotions or intent were masked. The truth of Barty Crouch Jr.'s escape would remain buried until the events of the Triwizard Tournament unraveled it years later. Then came 1993, the year of Azkaban's first true, unaided escape. The name Sirius Black would become synonymous with the impossible. A convicted murderer, an accused Death Eater, Sirius broke free using no outside help, no polyjuice potion, no disguise, only his animagus form. By transforming into a large black dog, Sirius evaded the Dementors' sensory abilities, which focused on human emotions. He later explained to Harry, "I was stronger than the rest of them. I didn't lose myself. I knew I was innocent, and that wasn't a happy thought. So the Dementors couldn't suck it out of me, but it kept me sane and helped me keep my powers." Sirius's escape sent shockwaves through the wizarding world. The Ministry scrambled to save face, launching a frantic manhunt. Azkaban's aura of impenetrability was shattered. In 1996, things grew far worse. In what would be called the mass breakout, 10 high-risk prisoners, including Bellatrix Lestrange, escaped Azkaban. This time, the prison wasn't outwitted by clever magic. It was betrayed. Voldemort had returned, and with him, the Dementors had begun to shift their allegiance. Cornelius Fudge, then Minister for Magic, reluctantly confirmed the breakout. "We believe the Dementors are no longer under our control. They have joined he who must not be named." 1 year later, in 1997, Azkaban was no longer a Ministry stronghold. After Voldemort seized control of the government, the prison was overrun. The Dementors, now fully aligned with Voldemort, allowed Death Eaters to walk free. Innocent witches and wizards, particularly Muggleborns and Ministry dissenters, were thrown in without trial, while the guilty were released. By the end of the Second Wizarding War, the notion of Azkaban as a just and secure prison had all but dissolved. Its walls still stood, but its purpose had been utterly corrupted. Azkaban in Voldemort's second rise, from 1995 to 1998. With the return of Voldemort and the gradual collapse of Ministry control, Azkaban entered its darkest and most lawless era. No longer a prison of justice, it became a weapon, one used not to contain evil, but to silence resistance. By the mid-1990s, the Dementors had fully turned against the Ministry, siding with Voldemort out of pure instinct. They craved despair, and the Dark Lord offered a world soaked in fear and suffering. Under his growing influence, Azkaban no longer even pretended to uphold justice. Once Voldemort seized the Ministry in 1997, the prison transformed completely. The Dementors no longer guarded criminals. They now presided over a systematic purge. Innocent Muggleborns, accused of stealing magic, were sent to Azkaban without trial. So were witches and wizards who spoke out against Voldemort or refused to follow the new regime. The fortress became a machine of terror, swallowing victims in silence. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Harry saw this transformation firsthand during the trial of Muggle-born Mary Cattermole. "They have been brought here for questioning and will be sent to Azkaban," said Yaxley coldly, "unless they can prove that they have wizarding ancestry." These were not criminals, but scapegoats, rounded up and condemned simply for their bloodline or beliefs. For them, Azkaban wasn't just imprisonment, it was erasure. The Dementors flourished during this time. With no moral boundaries imposed by the Ministry, they drained their victims freely, feeding endlessly on helplessness. Some prisoners were reported to have lost the ability to speak after only days. Others deteriorated into catatonia, no longer capable of even recognizing their own names. No stories of redemption came from Azkaban during Voldemort's rule. There were no secret rescues, no daring escapes, only silence, and the sound of the sea breaking endlessly against the stone. It was, by every definition, the complete failure of wizarding justice. But justice would return. With Voldemort's final defeat at the Battle of Hogwarts in 1998, the prison's corruption was exposed. Survivors who had been freed from Azkaban spoke of horrors few could imagine, and the wizarding world, shaken to its core, began to reckon with the truth. Azkaban had not just housed darkness, it had become it. After Voldemort's defeat, the fall of Voldemort in 1998 did not merely end a war, it sparked a reckoning. Among the many institutions that required reform in the wake of the Second Wizarding War, none bore more shame than Azkaban. Once hailed as an unbreachable prison, it had become a vessel of cruelty, a place where innocence was devoured as readily as guilt. Kingsley Shacklebolt, who had fought valiantly in the Order of the Phoenix, was appointed interim minister for magic and later took the post permanently. One of his first acts in office was to initiate sweeping reforms to the wizarding justice system, starting with Azkaban. It was clear to all that the use of dementors could no longer be justified. Their allegiance to Voldemort, their intrinsic cruelty, and their utter indifference to right and wrong made them unfit as guards. Shacklebolt ordered them permanently removed from the prison. This decision marked a turning point in magical governance. Human auras, combined with a network of magical enchantments, became the new custodians of Azkaban's security. The reforms didn't stop at the gate. Inside, conditions were transformed. Azkaban ceased to be a place of torment and became, for the first time in its history, a genuine prison, one focused not on endless despair, but on containment, accountability, and where possible, rehabilitation. The very architecture of Azkaban began to change. While its outer walls remained forbidding, symbolic of its past, its interior was modified to reduce the psychological trauma prisoners endured. No longer were inmates left to rot in stone cells without light, hope, or human contact. The wizarding world, still grieving and rebuilding, welcomed this change. After decades of denial, the magical community was finally ready to ask what it truly meant to punish someone, and whether punishment should destroy a person entirely. Professor Dumbledore, though long past, had once warned, "It is not our abilities that show what we truly are, it is our choices." And the wizarding world, in choosing to reshape Azkaban, began making better ones. Azkaban still held prisoners. Of course, dark wizards and dangerous individuals were still locked away, but under strict oversight and with ethical boundaries. The whispers of dementors faded from the walls, replaced by a quiet sense of justice long overdue. Modern reforms. In the years that followed the Second Wizarding War, Azkaban stood at the intersection of legacy and change. The reforms initiated by Minister Kingsley Shacklebolt signaled a radical shift in how the magical world treated incarceration. For centuries, punishment in Azkaban had meant despair, degradation, and decay of the soul. But now, the wizarding world was committed to a more humane vision of justice, one that emphasized responsibility without cruelty. The first and most profound reform was the permanent removal of dementors from the prison. These creatures, once seen as an efficient solution, were finally recognized for what they truly were: unreliable instruments of suffering. With their departure, the emotional climate of Azkaban changed dramatically. No longer did prisoners collapse under the invisible weight of hopelessness the moment they arrived. Instead, their mental and emotional well-being became part of the conversation, a concept that had been alien to the prison for centuries. A new class of magical security was implemented in their place. Human guards, specifically trained in high-level defensive magic and mental resilience, took on the role of overseeing inmates. Protective enchantments were layered into the structure, wards that detected escape attempts, enchantments to prevent magical interference, and charms designed to maintain order without abuse. Most significantly, a rehabilitation initiative was introduced for certain classes of offenders. Wizards who had committed crimes under duress, influence, or ignorance rather than out of true malice were given the opportunity to participate in programs designed to reintegrate them into society. These programs included educational sessions, mental healing with trained mediwitches and wizards, and structured time to reflect on their choices. This was not about leniency. Dangerous individuals, including unrepentant Death Eaters, remained locked away for life. But the reform recognized a truth often ignored during war. Not all those who end up in prison are evil, and not all evil can be eradicated through suffering. One retired Auror, interviewed in the Daily Prophet, commented on the new Azkaban. "It's still a prison. No one's getting a holiday. But we're no longer feeding the monsters, and that's something to be proud of." Public opinion remained divided at first. Some still believed the prison should be a place of torment for the worst offenders. But gradually, as peace settled over the wizarding world and people began to value healing over vengeance, Azkaban's new role was accepted. The fortress was no longer a tool of fear. It had become a symbol of growth. The scars of its past would never fully disappear. But in their place stood a new ideal: that justice without cruelty is not weakness, but wisdom. Location and architecture. Azkaban's location has always played a key role in both its mythos and its function. Situated on a remote and unplottable island in the middle of the North Sea, it is inaccessible to muggles and nearly unreachable even to wizards without authorization. From the moment a prisoner arrives, they are enveloped not only in confinement, but in absolute isolation. The island itself is a grim and desolate place, lashed endlessly by cold winds and harsh waves. The surrounding sea is perpetually stormy, the skies overhead grey and churning. It is said that even approaching Azkaban by broom or magical transport feels like passing into another realm, one heavy with ancient pain. The fortress is built of dark stone, rising like a jagged spike from the center of the island. Its walls are thick, cold, and bare of ornamentation, designed not for beauty or comfort, but for containment. There are no cheerful fires, no comforting lights. Every corridor is shadowed, every door iron-bound, and the chill seems to seep into your bones, even without the presence of dementors. When dementors still guarded Azkaban, the environment itself seemed cursed by their aura. As Professor Lupin once said, "They infest the darkest, filthiest places. They glory in decay and despair." That description could not have been more apt. The entire structure pulsed with a quiet dread, Cells were narrow, often windowless, and laid out in a labyrinthine pattern that disoriented even the guards. Sound carried strangely, with whispers echoing down stone corridors long after voices had fallen silent. There are no known maps of Azkaban's internal layout. It is kept secret, even from most ministry workers, and changed magically over the years for security. The only consistent descriptions come from survivors, few and far between, who describe the cells as small, cold, and devoid of anything remotely comforting. Even after the dementors were removed, the island's bleakness remained. The structure itself had absorbed too much of its dark history to ever be completely cleansed. The enchantments used to protect the island are formidable. Anti-disapparition jinxes, anti-portkey wards, enchantments that confuse or repel magical navigation, making unauthorized arrival or escape virtually impossible. In many ways, the architecture of Azkaban is not just physical, it is symbolic. Every stone is a monument to the long history of magical punishment. The fortress was built not only to imprison bodies, but to contain darkness. Today, though its insides have softened slightly under reform, its outer shell remains the same, towering, cold, and silent, a place no wizard ever wishes to see twice. Known Azkaban inmates. Over the centuries, Azkaban has housed some of the most infamous names in magical history. Individuals whose crimes ranged from petty defiance of magical regulations to unspeakable acts of cruelty. While some were truly dangerous, others were victims of political scapegoating or miscarriages of justice. The prison's dark legacy is etched in the stories of those it held behind its cursed walls. Dolores Umbridge, once a high-ranking ministry official and senior undersecretary to the Minister for Magic. Dolores Umbridge was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment in Azkaban for her role during Voldemort's puppet regime, as head of the Muggle-born Registration Commission. She orchestrated the torture, wrongful imprisonment, and, in some cases, deaths of numerous Muggle-born witches and wizards. Her cruelty, masked by her prim demeanor, was unrelenting. After Voldemort's fall, she was tried for crimes against humanity and stripped of all official titles. "She's vile," Harry once said. "The world would be a better place without her in it." Umbridge remains incarcerated in Azkaban to this day. Percival Dumbledore, the father of Albus Dumbledore. Percival was sentenced to life in Azkaban after attacking 3 Muggle boys who had brutally assaulted his daughter, Ariana. Though his actions were out of vengeance, he refused to explain his motives in court in order to protect Ariana's condition, and thus appeared as a dangerous aggressor who had violated the international statute of secrecy. He died during his imprisonment, leaving behind a legacy of silence and sorrow. His son, Albus, later reflected, "He never said why he did it, because he was protecting us." Augustus Rookwood, a former unspeakable in the Department of Mysteries. Rookwood was convicted for spying on the Ministry and passing information to Voldemort during both wars. Initially sentenced to life imprisonment, he escaped during the January 1996 mass breakout. Rookwood returned to Voldemort's side and fought in the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, and later the Battle of Hogwarts, where he was ultimately defeated by Aberforth Dumbledore. His double life as a Ministry agent and Death Eater made him one of the most dangerous infiltrators of the First Wizarding War. Stan Shunpike, a conductor on the night bus, Stan was arrested during the height of Voldemort's rise under false pretenses, accused of Death Eater sympathies to appease public fear. His imprisonment was widely seen as unjust, a symbolic arrest to show the Ministry was doing something. Stan later escaped in the 1997 breakout and was seen among Voldemort's ranks, though he appeared to be under the Imperious curse, not acting of his own will. His case remains one of the most tragic examples of political scapegoating. Crispin Kronk, less infamous, but still recorded in the annals of Azkaban's history. Kronk was sentenced for the illegal ownership of sphinxes, classified as highly dangerous magical creatures. He reportedly kept them in his backyard for years before being discovered, though not known to be violent. The danger posed by his pets earned him a lengthy sentence. He eventually died, though it is unclear whether this occurred during or after his time in Azkaban. These names are but a glimpse into the vast, shadowed ledger of Azkaban. Some earned their fate. Others were swallowed by fear and bureaucracy, but each of them, in their own way, became part of the prison's haunted legacy, etched into stone, whispered in corridors, and remembered with a shudder. Significance in wizarding culture. In the minds of most witches and wizards, Azkaban is more than just a prison. It is a symbol of ultimate punishment, of what happens when law turns into fear, and when justice is enforced by beings that have no understanding of mercy. From the youngest Hogwarts student to the oldest member of the Wizengamot, the name Azkaban evokes a visceral reaction. It is not whispered like Voldemort's name, but it carries a similar chill. To be sent to Azkaban is not just to be imprisoned. It is to be forgotten, consumed by shadows and left behind by the world. This cultural weight is evident in everyday conversation. Parents tell their children to behave or they'll end up in Azkaban. Auras speak of it in hushed, respectful tones. Even hardened criminals fear it, not for the confinement, but for the emptiness it promises. Hermione Granger once remarked, after witnessing the prison's legacy firsthand, Azkaban doesn't just lock you away, it breaks you, piece by piece, until you don't even know who you are anymore. The role of Azkaban in wizarding history has shifted. Once viewed as a necessary evil, it is now recognized as a monument to the darker instincts of magical governance, an embodiment of punishment without compassion. Its transformation in the modern era, from soul-crushing dungeon to monitored institution, represents the broader journey of the wizarding world toward ethical responsibility. Nevertheless, its presence still looms large. In literature, it's used as a cautionary tale. In politics, it's referenced during debates about justice and magical rights. And in everyday speech, it remains a powerful metaphor for isolation, for suffering, and for the price of choices made in the shadows. Even now, decades after Voldemort's fall and the reforms that followed, Azkaban reminds every witch and wizard of a core truth, that fear, when left unchecked, can shape entire systems. And so, Azkaban remains, cold, towering, silent, not just a place but a galaxy, but a memory etched into the heart of wizarding Britain, a warning and a lesson, standing alone in the sea.